Well, welcome to Christian Answers. This is Pastor Jeff Short. This is a program, Christian Answers, where we try to make sense of what is happening in our world and in our culture and approach everything from a biblical Christian standpoint. We want to live consistent Christian lives. We want to think consistently. We want to act consistently, behave consistently, feel consistently. We want to have consistent living based on the Bible. We want to have families that are consistent, churches that are consistent with the Bible. We want to walk and live in the will of God. We don't want to be hypocritical, walking outside of God's will and doing whatever we want to do. That's what the world does. The world runs here and runs there and does this and does that. It's totally willy-nilly, chaotic. It's a chaotic mess in the world. But we want to live as Christians in this world. And the way that we do that is we know what the Word of God says, we know what God's will is, and then we live consistently with the will of God. Well, that brings us to the topic of today's program. You may not know, you may know that I am ordained in the Southern Baptist Convention. I was ordained decades ago in the Southern Baptist Convention. I've worked in Southern Baptist conventions for 30-some years. I have also worked in different churches other than the Southern Baptist Convention, but I was ordained in the Southern Baptist Convention right out of seminary, and unfortunately, I have seen some changes in the Southern Baptist Convention that are alarming to me, and not just to me, but to a lot of other people also. And one of the alarming aspects of what I'm seeing today in the Southern Baptist Convention with this new generation of leadership is that they are willing to basically go along with the culture if they think it will make them popular with the culture. And they're willing to virtue signal, and they're willing to let the culture set the agenda and then live within that agenda. That's what the modern day Southern Baptist Convention seems to be saying. For example, on the issue of race in our culture, in the last 4 or 5 years, especially during the pandemic, we've seen this Black Lives Matter movement. We've seen a movement that wants to label all white people as racist. They want to label this whole country, the whole 1776 onward project, as white supremacist. And they want to lay on this whole guilt trip to white people simply because white people are white. And this is nonsense from a theological standpoint, from a spiritual standpoint, and also from a common sense standpoint. We live in a time where no one is a slave of anyone in the United States. And especially when you're considering there might be some sex workers who are enslaved and sex trafficking, that kind of thing that goes on. And there's some kind of a network of that. And that we all know that's bad and that needs to be rooted out. But as far as racial slavery, there is no plantation now that has slavery on it. There are no slaveholders. There are no slaves operating in the United States. That's been over for 150 years. That's been over, thank God. And there was a whole war that settled that issue. And then the whole issue of the lingering effects of slavery with the segregation in the South and separate bathrooms, separate drinking fountains for blacks, separate bathrooms for whites. That whole problem has been dealt with and has been basically solved for the last 50 years. And so we have made, as a country, quite a bit of progress. You might say that this is probably one of the nicer places to live if you are a black person on the planet Earth, especially when you look at the chaos of, for example, many of the African countries over there now. There is no question that there is a huge difference between the way things were 150 years ago with slavery and then even 50 years ago with the segregation in the South. And so right now in the 21st century, we live in a pretty equal and equitable culture. And yet we are being told, fed a narrative by these race activists. You might even call them race hustlers, like the Al Sharptons of the world, the Jesse Jacksons of the world, these Benjamin Crumb, the oily lawyer that always seems to be around when there's some kind of a police beating of a black man, and always capitalizing on the anger in the black community and just stirring up trouble and hatred and riots. These black activists have tried to paint a picture of this country as if it's a living hell for black people. And as LeBron James said hyperbolically, he said black men are being hunted down by white people. It's just incredible, the lies and the false narratives that are being spread. But instead of addressing the truth, and instead of rebuking the lies, one of the trends in major denominations all across the country, and especially now we're seeing this in the Southern Baptist Convention, is instead of challenging those false narratives and being leaders and leading people into truth, the Southern Baptist Convention seems to be going along with these false narratives because they're popular. They seem to resonate with a lot of people, and so we're just going to go with it. We're just going to buy into these false narratives instead of standing on the truth and saying, look, this country isn't perfect. And no doubt there is tension between different ethnic groups. If you're Chinese American, if you're Japanese American, if you're Black American, if you're Hispanic American, if you're white in America, there are going to be tensions and friction between all kinds of ethnic groups, because ethnic groups mean there is going to be a difference in culture somewhat. And so there's never going to be a time when there isn't some kind of a tension. I remember when I was growing up, there was the big thing was you would hear Polish jokes all over the place. They're called Polak jokes. And the Polish people and nationality would be like at the front end of that joke. Well, if you were Polish, that might not have been as funny, and you might have felt a little bit put off by that. Okay, but you didn't riot in the streets, and you didn't burn down buildings, and you didn't make this into some kind of a fake crisis in our culture. In the same way with any ethnic group, Italian Americans had trouble in the United States when they first immigrated. Irish people in Boston and New England had trouble, tensions. Hispanics now coming up from Mexico and South America and Central America, there are tensions. And it's a fact of life that people who are different are going to rub each other a little differently. But overall, our country is a great place to live, no matter what your ethnic group is. And so the message should be that we want to love all people, we want to be kind and patient with all people, and teach the general virtues of what the Lord wills for us as taught in the Bible. And we don't pick one race and pander and cater to one race and act like they're the sole victims of all bad and evil. And then you want to target one race and say white people are the source of all evil. White supremacy is the cause of all troubles in the minority communities, blah, blah, blah. You want to sift through all the rhetoric and the false lies and narratives. You want to say this is the truth and this is a lie. And that's leadership. And that's spiritual leadership. You want pastors who will speak the truth and not simply go along because it's easier to go along. Well, unfortunately, we're seeing today a problem in the Southern Baptist Convention because we are seeing the top leaders, right on down from the president, executive committee, all kinds of boards, on the Southern Baptist Convention. We're seeing some of the seminaries and some of the high-profile leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention, they're simply caving in and going along with the narrative and assuming that whatever the mainstream media is reporting, whatever the universities and colleges, secular state and universities are saying, that must be true. Whatever the government and the Joe Biden administration, the liberals, the leftists are pushing, it must be true. So we just have to go with that reality and follow along. Well, we don't, and we shouldn't, because they're lies that are being pushed on our country, and it's dividing our country, and it's also going to divide the church. When you start targeting white people as the source of all evil, and when you start telling them that they're prejudiced and they're racist, whether they know it or not, whether they've done anything racist or not, they're still prejudiced and racist because by virtue of being white, and teaching this critical race theory in the schools and even in the churches sometimes, you're going to divide the church. And that's what's taking place in the Southern Baptist Convention, because these leaders are following a false narrative. They're reading the false script of the mainstream media, and they're actually going to be dividing the church when they're telling us that they're actually trying to bring about unity. Now, what prompted this video is I received an email from the Southern Baptist Convention of Michigan promoting a crisis conference on so-called racial reconciliation. So you get this email talking about, we need unity in the Southern Baptist Convention. We need unity in the church. We need unity in the country. And we need to address this crisis problem of disunity among the races and everything. And I just sat back and said, what are you doing? What is the crisis? Define crisis and define why we have to spend so much time, energy, and resources in addressing a problem that isn't a problem. And so while we spend all of our time following the mainstream media lies about this white supremacy, white racist movement to trying to suppress minorities, we need to step back and say, well, wait a minute, is this really a crisis? And are people actually doing this? And when you dig down deep enough, you'll realize that the statistics and evidence and the facts on the ground say this is not happening. It's all a false crisis being pushed by activists who want to bring about change selfishly, I would say, for their own purpose. And so here, I'll show you the email that I received. I'll bring it up on screen here. And here it is. It says that we want racial unity in the church. Well, of course we want racial unity in the church. Why wouldn't we want racial unity in the church? Racial unity in the SBC. A conversation with Fred Luter and Ed Litton. So, Fred Luter was a past Southern Baptist Convention president, happens to be black. I think he was the president in 2012. Okay, great. Fantastic. And then here's the, just last year, president of the Southern Baptist Convention, who is Ed Litton. And Ed Litton, as we all know, if you follow Southern Baptist News, was copying sermons from other pastors, basically lifting them word for word and using them in his own sermons, but he didn't mention the fact that he was borrowing from other pastors. So committing plagiarism, and just really a weak leader who doesn't even want to write his own sermons. He also employed the services of a sermon writing online company and would get his sermons from them sometimes. Just a very, very weak leader. So we have a weak leader in Ed Litton, and we have a leader here that really is not a role model. And I don't know a lot about Luter, but these two men are going to meet. It's going to be a big deal, and the Southern Baptist Convention was making a really big deal about it. And they're going to meet and have a conversation about racial reconciliation. A black minister and a white minister, and is sponsored by the Ethics and Religious Liberty Committee. It's going to be a webcast, and all the pastors were invited to watch this important webcast because it addresses the issue of racial reconciliation. And it's such a needed thing. This is so important, according to these leaders, that we need to address it right now. Now, what is the immediate prompt? You might wonder, what is the immediate prompt why this crisis conference and discussion needs to take place? I mean, you can think of all kinds of other issues that are affecting Christians, the breakdown of the public schools, the rampant sexual immorality, the radical transgender and LGBTQ assault on all of culture. You know, abortion continues and is growing even bolder in many states, even after the reversal of Roe v. Wade. So all kinds of moral, spiritual issues that are on the docket. Why the rush to have a, quote, conversation on race? Why the rush? Well, maybe because of the Tyree Nichols incident where 5 black officers beat and kicked and basically killed another black man. And so now we need a conversation on race because of that. There isn't a race conflict involved there. 5 black officers killing a black suspect. Where's the race component there? There is no race component. But the activists and the liberal leftists and the Democrats, they're all jumping on this incident and saying, see, that's an example of white supremacy, even though there's no connection to white racism at all. And so we have, again, another situation where a black man is killed by police, and the assumption is automatically that must be racial. That must be a race-motivated crime, even though all of the participants are black. It doesn't make sense. It's irrational. It's illogical. And yet, that's the way we're being propagandized and we're being brainwashed by the left because everything is turned into race. Everything is about race. Everything is about white racism and white supremacy and white blame for all the ills of society. So you just use an incident like this where there's no white people involved and you just blame them anyway because that's the playbook. Well, so now the Southern Baptist Convention, I guess, feels, it's so important that we address this key issue of race because we need to get out in front of this and really show that we are all in on racial reconciliation. Instead of saying, hey, what we need to do is we need to actually talk about the more important issue, and that is how to resist the propaganda lies and brainwashing that we're getting from powerful institutions, the mainstream media, the federal government, corporations now are all on the woke bandwagon. And so what the topic of discussion should be, if there's going to be a topic of discussion, it needs to be how do we deal with the heavy, intensive, false narratives that are flying fast in our society and confusing people. That's the real discussion that needs to take place. instead of all of these fake and false narratives that are being spun by people who have agendas. And so we don't see that conversation, though. We don't see the SBC saying, hey, look, we've got to get together and we've got to talk about the lies that are being fed in the church that are trying to divide us, because we are united. We don't have churches that hate races. We don't have churches that are discriminating and think of themselves as superior because of their race. We don't have that problem, thank God. And so what we need to do is be discerning and understand what is taking place in our society, even though they're trying to pin this on specific races. And that's wrong. Let's read another part of that email that was sent to me, and we're going to find out a little bit more about what they have in mind in bringing about this, quote, conversation. So it says right here that join two former SBC presidents, Ed Litton and Fred Luter, in an important conversation hosted by ERLC President Brent Leatherwood on Thursday, February 9th. So this is an important conversation. Very, very important, because as we all know, that there's a problem in white supremacy and racism in our culture, so we have to address it as Southern Baptists. We got to head it off at the pass. We got to get out in front of this, and that's the way the ERLC and the Southern Baptist Convention leadership is positioning this. And again, that is totally a false narrative. What we need to be having a conversation, like I said before, is how to deal with the lies that are flying fast and heavy in our culture and attacking our churches and blaming people, and the satanic attack on Christians by the devil. The accuser of the brethren says that we need to be aware of Satan, who falsely accuses the brethren, and he does so all the time. Well, that's what's taking place here. The mainstream media and the narrative by the activists is that white people are racist to the core, and they think of themselves as supreme, and they discriminate against their black brothers and sisters. Well, that's a lie. That's a false narrative that is being pushed in the culture today, and it's not a reality. And you can walk into churches all the time on Sunday morning, and people are not that way. That is false. We don't have to have conversations to remind people, now you don't be racist, don't be a white supremacist. People aren't even thinking that way. So it's a false problem that is in search of a fix. It doesn't need fix because it's not a problem. And I defy people in the Southern Baptist Convention to point to a Southern Baptist church anywhere and say, there you go, there's the white supremacist church, there's the racist church right there, there it is. Point it out. Get specific. What do you mean by we have a problem in the church of racism? Flesh that out. Bring forth the evidence. It's not there. It says, as Christians, we are called to model a better way in this fallen world, a way that reveals the inherent dignity of each individual made in the image of God. Okay, that's true. Just as the image of God, Imago Dei, influences our work to save preborn and care for the vulnerable, it also drives our work to advance unity and racial reconciliation. Well, what you should have written is, it has influenced our work and has influenced unity and racial reconciliation, and that work has been done. Now, yeah, there's always room for improvement in every area, and sin is pernicious, and it will raise its ugly head once in a while. But this is acting as if people are still enslaved. And there's still plantations in the South, and we've got to free those slaves, and we've got to stop the segregation and all that. Hey, that's already been accomplished. Oh, we've got to end prejudice. Well, that's largely been accomplished. The reality is most people in this country, whether they're Christian or not, are not prejudiced. They don't think of themselves as better, their race better than others. And especially in the churches, you're going to have to point out, you're going to have to look really deep to find anything like racism and prejudice in churches today. It's not there. It's not a crisis. There are real crises in our culture. And the real crises, abortion, the killing, the slaughtering of unborn, that needs talked about, and we need to have conferences, and we need to have leaders talking anxiously about how can we stop this. That's what we need. Also, the transgender movement that is sweeping into schools and junior high and high school and college and telling especially young women that they need to become boys and they need to transition and they need to have operations and they need to switch from girl to boy, and this brainwashing is taking place. That's a crisis. That social contagion of transitioning. These are crises. And you have all kinds of other crises going on. But one of the crises that is not going on, because it's not a crisis, is racism and white supremacy. It is a false narrative. So to have the Southern Baptist Convention put up these events and claim that it's a crisis in our culture. That is the crisis. Is that the crisis in the Southern Baptist Convention is that the leaders would rather follow culture than follow Scripture and address the truth. See, there needs to be a dialogue on separating the falsehoods from the truth. There needed to be that with the George Floyd incident, but there wasn't with the George Floyd incident. For example, Southern Baptist leaders continually, and they still do, and pastors in the Southern Baptist Convention look at George Floyd incident and say, see, that's white racism. And yet, explain what the racism is. When I look at that, I see police brutality. I see excessive force. I don't see racism. There was no shred of evidence that said that that was a racist act. The officer in question wasn't convicted under racist charges. But yet the narrative keeps spinning on. So we need to be discerning. We need to be smart and wise and not fall into the lies of our culture. Hope that's been helpful. We'll see you back next week. God bless.